All right, so we're going to start out our tour here. This is our Leatherwood Distillery tasting room, but it's also kind of a bar, which is another thing I didn't talk about before. I planned to open a distillery and not a bar, but it ended up being the bar was kind of more lucrative at the start than kind of kept the bills going and helped us make more whiskey and put it away in barrels and stuff like that. So this has become the local hangout, kind of an SF and veterans hangout. So we're pretty much stuck with a bar from now on. And we even started out with just doing our cocktails with the alcohol we make. And then as we started going through it, we realized, a couple would come in. One likes to drink liquor, one would like some beer. So we went and got a beer license. Now we have over 50 different craft beers and all the domestic beers as well. And then I have a guy now that makes barbecue for us, so we have some sandwiches and stuff like that for people to eat. But really, so this place started out with just some pictures of me on deployment. Like over here, we got pictures from Afghanistan. And then we have all the flags up here. I'm not sure if you can see them because of the light, but we got the Afghan flag, seeing as how Masood helped me build this place. We figured we better put the Afghan flag up. Then we've got the 160th flag, and of course, for my wife, we have the Jordanian flag.
Yeah, those are pretty hard to see.
Yeah. And then, just slowly things started adding on. Up over here, this was my retirement plaque. And all those coins up there, I started out with about 10 of them, and then as people would come in, they'd just give me a coin, and the collection just grew like crazy. In fact, I probably have enough to do another roll. We're going to make a nice shadow box. Those barrel heads up there that are all signed, those are individuals who have bought their own barrel. And they got to go through the whole process. So once a month, they would come in, they would taste the barrel until it was ready, and they wanted to bottle it. So we bottled it for them. And then they also got to keep the barrel. This bar, Masood and I built it. This is a cedar tree that got struck by lightning on my property. Had another SF guy, had Alaska sawmill, so he cut it up into boards and then built the bar top from it. Over here, this is our memorial wall. And this has all the guys from 5th Group that have been killed in either Iraq or Afghanistan from during the time that I was there. And every anniversary on their death, we always have a bottle with 2 shot glasses up here. And at the end of the day, we'll do a little toast. We just put this parachute up. One of the guys that works for me, Dave, he used to be a 5th Group rigger. And he found someone from DRMO. They were getting ready to just burn this thing up because it's unusable. So they let us have it. And yes, it only took about a week before a bra started hanging from it. I wasn't part of that. So as we go in this room, we open this up. When we started out, the tasting room ended right here. But we started getting so many people in here, we had to open it up for more tables. Right now, this room, since we're not allowed to have people dine in or sit down and have a drink, this room has become kind of the office and our bottle labeling area now that we're making hand sanitizer. So over here, I'm just keeping track of orders and trying to get all the ingredients and order the bottles. And then we have every day 2 or 3 people in here labeling bottles. Right now, we've got almost 5,000 bottles labeled. And that's not even a quarter of the amount of orders that people have said they want. So as we can come through here. Usually this area right here is where we have live music. We usually have 1 or 2 people playing live music Fridays and Saturdays. But everything's moved off to the side, so we got room for labeling and stuff like that. Man, I should have set this up. Let me move this out of the way for you. So this is my original still. I built it 20 years ago. It's literally just a beer keg. It's a copper column. It's got a thermometer up here. This copper pipe comes out and there's a sheath around it. This is what you call your condenser. You can hook a water hose up to here and you're out here. So this sits on top of a turkey cooker, basically just a propane cooker. Heats up the mash, turns the alcohol to vapor. Vapor comes across here and drops down into the liquid form and we capture it. This is your homemade moonshine still. So then as we come back here, this is the kettle for our still. Normally, we would have it set up in this configuration for cooking mash. But seeing how we're making hand sanitizer right now, we're just going to use this as our mixing pot. This is a large agitator, so inside here there's a big wing, so it'll just become a big mixer. So we can do 200-gallon batches in here. And I think that this is one piece of equipment that really keeps so many other people from trying to make this stuff. Because, you know, this thing alone is a $15,000 piece of equipment. Nobody's really going to buy a $15,000 piece of equipment just to make hand sanitizer for 4 months. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to mix all our ingredients in here to make hand sanitizer. You need 96% alcohol. You need glycerol and hydrogen peroxide. Mix it all together. And then over here, this is our mash pump. Normally we would pump our mash out of the kettle once we cook it, and we'll pump it into this room, which is our mash room. What we're doing is we're retrofitting our pipes. Our normal pipes are high heat pipes. And there's so much mash and other stuff inside of them, we can't use them to pump sterile fluid through it. So we bought new see-through pipes. We're just changing the fittings around. We had to, you know, sterilize the inside of this pump. But what we're going to do is we'll mix up our juice in here. We'll use this pump to pump it into this room. And right now we've got this room set up with 3 filling stations. And you can see we have thousands of these just little 8-ounce bottles that we're going to use for the hand sanitizer. So this is the approved label. All we did was put our logo on it, basically. But, you know, the front side basically tells you what it is, and the back side lets you know that it's the World Health Organization formula and what that is. So once we pump the hand sanitizer in here, we're just going to have somebody here manually filling bottles, putting them over here, another person capping them and putting them in a box. So we're hoping to have 3 people doing that at one time. And normally this would be our fermentation room. So it's temperature controlled. We'd have all these tanks full of mash fermenting. We've got a AC unit over there just to keep the temperature right. But yeah, so right now it's just going to be used as a hand sanitizer filling area. Now to switch over back to what we were doing, so I'll go through the process for making whiskey, right? So a lot of distilleries have 2 pieces of equipment. They have one still, and then they have one mash cooker. What we do is 1 week we make our mash, and the second week we'll run that mash through the still and take all the alcohol out of it. So during our mash weeks, we'd have this set up like this. This is a 200-gallon jacketed still. There's a little layer of oil. It's just vegetable oil that surrounds the whole thing and underneath. And these are heating elements, just like the heating elements that go in a hot water heater. So those go into the oil, heat up the oil, which in turn heats up the mash that's inside. Reason why we do that, if those heating elements go straight into the liquid, those grains will scorch on top of that heating element. After a while, it's going to burn them out. And secondly, you start scorching grain in your mash, you're going to get really off foul flavors from it. So what we'll do is first, we'll fill this thing up with about 100 gallons of water. And we'll bring the temperature up to about 185 degrees. We'll add our corn first. Our corn gets cooked for an hour at 185. Then we'll add more cold water. We'll bring the temperature down to about 160. We'll add our wheat. It gets cooked for about an hour, and then we'll add a little more water, add our barley, and that's how we make our bourbon. One of the keys to being a micro distillery is we're small enough where we can adjust temperatures for each grain. If you cook each grain at its right temperature, you're not going to change any flavors of that grain. You're going to get the maximum amount of sugar out of the starches. Whereas if you're one of the big guys, you know, you make thousands of gallons at a time, you can't adjust those temperatures right. So the chances of them hitting those perfect temperatures is minimal. And that's a lot of times you drink some of the bigger distilleries whiskey and it really hits you in the back of the throat. And I think a lot of that's because maybe some of the lighter grains are getting scorched from being too hot. So it takes about 6 hours to make a batch of mash. And all we're doing when we say mashing in, what we're trying to do is we're trying to cook that grain, break down the starches, and pull as much sugar out of the grain as possible. Because there's 3 things you need to make alcohol. You need sugar, yeast, and water. And then anything else that goes into it is your flavor profile other than the yeast. So all we're doing is we're cooking the grain down, we're grabbing as much sugar out of it so that once we pump it into the mash room, we add our yeast. That yeast will have plenty of nutrients and plenty of sugar to create the alcohol. We use an American whiskey yeast. It's kind of a temperamental yeast, so we only get probably 9 or 10% alcohol out of our volume. Whereas when we make rum, it's only we actually add sugar, water. We put a turbo yeast into it, which is really strong, so we get almost 18% alcohol. So again, 3 things you need to make alcohol. That's water, sugar, and yeast. So once we get done fermenting this, we'll pump it into one of our big white totes. They're 275-gallon totes. We'll cool the mash down to about 90 degrees, and we'll add our yeast. The yeast will start to ferment within about 8 hours, and it takes about 4 or 5 days to ferment. What's happening when it's fermenting is the yeast is eating up all the sugars and all the proteins and all the nutrients in there, and it's creating alcohol, CO2, and that's it. So inside the mash room, we got a fan that's going all the time. When we have all 6 or 7 tanks in there going, there's so much CO2 in that room, it'll almost make you pass out, unless you have that fan going. So also like what I was saying about temperature, we keep that room temperature controlled because any change in temperature while it's fermenting is going to change your flavors. And if it gets too hot, you can actually kill the yeast, and if it gets too cold, your yeast can actually go dormant and it'll just stop fermenting. So let's come over here. I'm going to show you the parts to the still, and I can send you a picture of the still built, put together. So what we do after the still is, or after the mash is done fermenting, we'll pump it back into the same pot. But what we do is we build our still with all these parts. And if you think of that other column that I showed you out there on top of the beer keg, it's the same concept. All these pieces are going to stack up on top of each other, and it sits on top of the still. Then we have this. It's called a defibrillator, which is basically another condenser. This sits on top. So as we're cooking the vapor, as we're cooking the mash, all the vapor comes up through the still, and then this is sitting on top of it. It'll hit the cold air. So there's cold water coming in here. It circulates around here and pours out the backside. What happens is the vapor comes up through the still, hits that cold air, and turns back into liquid and drops back down. We call that reflux. At the beginning, what we're trying to do is we're trying to isolate as much of the methanol alcohol as we can. So there's 3 parts to your distillation process. You have your heads, your hearts, and your tails. Your heads is the first part of alcohol that comes out, and that comes out Really high proof, but it's methanol alcohol. Second part is your hearts. That's your ethanol alcohol. That's the drinkable alcohol. That's the really nice, clean stuff. The third part is your tails. And your tails, it's still ethanol alcohol. You could still drink it, but it's been cooking in there so long, I call it the wet dog smell. It starts to smell like a wet dog. It's got weird flavors in there. You're starting to get more water than alcohol vapor. So we cut that off, and we'll reuse that in the next batch. So once we isolate all the methanol inside the column, we'll change the temperature up here. Alcohol turns to vapor about 174 degrees, and then water will turn to vapor around 220. So as long as we keep this below 180, we're getting all our methanol out. That's your high proof, 190 proof methanol alcohol. So we'll let that all run out first, and then, like I said, a lot of the big distilleries have computers that tell them when the methanol's gone and the ethanol's coming out. We don't have that. So just from experience, I know as I taste it and I smell it, what proof the alcohol coming out is. That's how I know when all the methanol's gone. Once all the methanol's gone, we'll raise the temperature here up past 180, but not quite to 200. So we try to keep it between 180 and 190. And that's giving us our nice, clean ethanol alcohol. As the volume goes down inside the pot, your alcohol volume is going to go down. So your temperature rises when that volume goes down, as well as your vapor temperature. When your vapor temperature goes up, your proof goes down. So once we start getting to a lower proof, that's when the tails are coming out. We don't want to have that in our barrels or our bottles. So we go ahead and toss that. Once we get all the alcohol out of the still, it'll come over here. We'll weigh it. We proof it. We use hydrometers, scale. So you need your proof, your weight, and your temperature to find out exactly how many proof gallons you got. We get taxed by proof gallons. Once we're all done with that, we cut our whiskey down to 110 proof. It usually comes off the still about 150. We'll cut it down to 110. If you look here, these are some examples of your char levels you can get inside a barrel. So you can get a 1 through 4. We use a number 3. We're using smaller barrels, 25-gallon barrels. So our whiskey is not going to stay in there that long. So it's only in there about a year and a half. So we use a really heavy char, and a really heavy char gives you a lot of porous layers inside your barrel. Where if you're going to put something in a barrel for like 10 years, you would use a number 1 char for bourbon, because it has to be in a charred barrel. Other whiskeys don't have to be in a char barrel, so if you've ever had like a 12, 15 year, they didn't even char the inside. Because the whiskey literally sits in there and doesn't have too much interaction with the wood. This is actually our first barrel that we emptied, and you can see this color change line, this dark line. That's how far the whiskey went into the wood.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Now, so what happens if you have a higher char level with a...
So let's say you had a number 4 char and you left something in the barrel for 3, 4, 5 years. When you pull it out, it's going to taste like wood. It's not going to taste like whiskey anymore. Yeah. There are some people who like that heavy char wood whiskey. But a classic bourbon is around a number 2 or 3 char for about 2 to 4 years. And now we're starting to fill our big 53-gallon barrels. We're still using a number 3 because there's more volume, less surface area in there, so we still need that heavy char. One day when we get a lot bigger, we have a much bigger still, so we can fill barrels faster. We might start filling 53 gallons in like a number 2 char and leave it in there for 4 to 6 years. But right now, we just go off of flavor and smell. So once a month, we'll go through, whenever we need to empty a barrel, we'll test a bunch of different barrels. And then we'll mix a couple barrels. Whichever barrels give us the same flavor profile that we have already, those are the ones that we bottle. So it's never gone off of time. Like, a lot of people have been, their brains have been conditioned to say, oh, I need to have a 10-year-old bourbon. You don't. You can have a really nice bourbon if it's done right. And in the last section over here, this is our bottling and labeling area. Everything's really bottled by hand. This is our labeling machine. So we literally put a roll of labels on here. You take a bottle. In fact, I'll put one on there. You take a bottle, you stick it on here, and you roll this around, and it rolls the bottle and puts your label on. So for a while, we used to have longer labels, so we had to do it all by hand. So this was our labeling machine right here. We just put the bottle inside, so we knew where to line up the label and stick it on there, and it worked. Pretty much everything in here we've made. Even the still, we purchased all the different parts and put it all together. All our mash tanks are these white tanks out here. Yeah, and that's really the gist of the story here.
Right on. Well, I guess, tell folks, one last time, name of the bar, where to find you online, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so come find us at leatherwooddistillery.com. We're on Instagram and Facebook. It's all at Leatherwood Distillery. We're at 6381 Highway 41A in Pleasant View, Tennessee. Exit 24 off of Highway 24. And that's us.
All right. I'll have that all online.
Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Awesome, brother. Thanks,
Thanks
man.
a lot.
Cheers.